Greetings, programs, and welcome to another new episode of the Awesome Friday podcast, the only show on the entire internet where we talk about two movies each week with a sense of gravitas and humility. My name is Matthew, and with me, as usual, is Simon, who is smiling wryly for those of you at home, because he knows I'm talking shit. How are you, Simon?
I'm fine. Welcome, everyone. Come in, come join us. Have a cup of tea. I've just boiled the kettle. Come sit down next to me and my dog. There's always tea in this house. And sit down while we regale you with stories of two movies that you can also watch if you choose to. So come and join us.
Indeed. And our movies this week, it's one of those interesting weeks where the two movies we've ended up with are quite different. And I always sort of enjoy that.
Yes, they are. They are
I
very
mean,
different.
yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for an episode with a theme, and then there's something to be said for a week where we watch just two wildly different things. Because movies, as with all art, contain multitudes. Yeah, you heard it here
What
first.
do you prefer? What do you prefer? I prefer when we just choose two completely random things. So we got more to talk about. I run out of things to say if it's on the theme.
That's true. I actually do quite like it when the films are very, very, very different. I think it's more interesting personally.
Yeah.
And I also, I mean, anyone who's listened to the show for a while will have picked up on the fact that I try to make it so that we cover the big stuff when we can. Although, going to a cinema is a bit of a challenge lately still. But I also try and cover like smaller stuff, and especially I try to get us some Canadian stuff whenever I can. And I feel like that's sort of, as Canadian podcasters and as smaller podcasters, I feel like that's kind of at least in part, our responsibility to because like Disney doesn't need our help. Everyone knows that Guardians of the Galaxy 3 exists, right? But not everyone's going to know that the other film we're talking about this week exists. And I feel like that's more important than talking about something like Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah. So on the Canadian film note, the really good news this week is I'm just scanning to find the name of the distributor, but a brother has been picked up by a big US distributor for full theatrical release in the US, which is fantastic news because here we go. It's Vertical. Vertical has bought Brother for
Oh, nice.
US distribution rights, and that is a fantastic movie. And if you are if you see it pop up in the cinema around you, because it's getting periodical cinema runs here, but now Vertical's got it for the US. Hopefully, it'll gain a bit more momentum, and more people will see it. And it's a really, really good film. Like a great example of a very distinctly Canadian film as well. Or if there's that's such a huge umbrella term because Polaris is too, and they couldn't be completely different, but it couldn't be any more different. But Brother is really exceptional, and I learned a lot from it as well. It's really good.
Yep. Elevation Pictures, which co-produced it here and distributed here in Canada, is probably one of our biggest like national film distributors. But they typically, like, if you watch a film that's by A24 or Neon in Canada, chances are you're watching an Elevation Pictures release. But I'm really glad that it's going to get some wider releases outside of Canada, because I mean it cleaned up at the CSAs this year. It won, I think, everything it was nominated for except for one thing, and it was nominated for like everything. So, and it was entirely deserving. It was easily the best Canadian film last year.
Yeah. No, yes, that's true. That's true.
What so, were you about to? Were you about to disagree?
I was really completely captivated by Polaris. So personally, those two movies were an equal high point for me. So I would say Polaris is as good, but I think on a bigger technical level, Brother is the best Canadian movie of last year. I think it's certainly a movie that demonstrates that Canadian funded and directed not just filmed here, but actual Canadian films can hold their own against any American big production. It was just exceptional. But it was directed. What's his name? Clements Vigo. Is that the director?
Clement Virgo.
Clement Virgo. Thank you. Vigo's the guy from Ghostbusters.
I
Clement Virgo. I hadn't heard of him before, but I was so blown away by the way this was directed. I looked at his past movies, and the experiences speaks for itself. And if you want a really good example of the possibilities of Canadian film, and I said at the same time as well, it's been some really exceptional sci-fi coming out of indigenous filmmakers the last couple of years. That whereas they haven't always been wholly successful as a film as a whole, like Blood Quantum is a good example of that. The ideas and the processes behind it are super exciting with Night Raiders and Polaris I mentioned as well. I think there's the the indigenous history both before and after colonization really lends itself to the same kind of stories that are told really well through sci-fi, and I think that's a very very exciting time for um, that kind of filmmaking. I was speaking to a comic creator yesterday in the Vancouver Comic Art Show, which is a wonderful thing, and it's on. If it's still on at this time, then you should go if when you hear this. But as a comic creator, they're making a indigenous sci-fi comic, a graphic novel next year, and it's so steeped in like the colonial fears and the horrors of that against the sci-fi post-apocalyptic background, and I really love that crossover, and I think Canada's making some really great genre movies at the moment.
mean, there was a long period of time where um, there's a long period of time where I would argue that many or even most of Canada's best films were coming out of Quebec. They had a really strong film culture there. It's where we got filmmakers like Denis Villeneuve and Jean-Marc Vallée, um, and all kinds of others. But in the last, probably 5, 6 years, especially, I think most of our best Canadians, a lot of our best Canadian stories are coming out of Indigenous filmmaking, and they're making really interesting sci-fi, and they're making really interesting horror. And also just really interesting. There's a great film from last year, the year before, called Bootleggers, which is all just about like returning to a reservation and trying to make it a better place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I feel like they're having a moment. And Blood Quantum, which you mentioned, is another great example of that, like an indigenous horror science fiction moment that's happening. And I really hope it continues. Um, we're and like one of our earliest episodes of this podcast, we talked about that film Beans, which is effectively an interrogation of a horrible atrocity that happened to
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous people in Quebec, and I feel like, again, like, I just hope this moment continues for a while because it's going really well, and I
I,
think it's also just important that we confront our history through art in
mm,
a way that maybe we haven't been previously.
there's something about indigenous, like the humor of that culture really works for sci-fi and horror in the same way that say British humor in Shaun of the Dead works. That balance, like we there was an indigenous sci-fi horror. I can't remember the name, but it had a thing. It was an alien that took over like bodies and had tentacles, and it was a group of young girls. I'm not sure you've seen it actually. The group of young girls basically in this small community fight an alien that crash lands and starts taking over bodies, and it's this really nice mix of sci-fi and horror, but also this kind of fatalistic, quick, sarcastic humor as well. Which, um, if you saw The Last of Us, it was a really good example of that in The Last of Us TV show, where they come across an old native like granddad and grandma, and Joel's holding a gun up. The reason Joel put his gun down is that the grandma offered him a bowl of soup when he came in, and it's a very very funny scene, and that kind of humor, that kind of dry sarcastic humor works really really well against
Hmm.
sci-fi and horror.
Yeah, I mean that it helps in that case when you get, you know, legendary actors like Graham Greene to be the people in the show. uh, but yeah,
I don't know who Graham Greene is.
what?
Is he a Canadian actor?
He's like a very famous
Oh, that dude. Right,
indigenous
right.
Canadian actor who, you know, is Academy Award
Yep.
nominated for Dancing with Wolves, and
Oh yeah.
you
Right.
know
He's good. Yeah.
he's always been great, and
Yep.
he has a very particular, yeah, that sort of
Yeah.
dry sarcasm sense of humor. It works really really well.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
So, yes, what were you talking about? Your promotion of Canadian movies. Yes, that's always a good thing because I have much less understanding and visibility of it than
Well,
you do.
part of it. Well, I mean, part of it is that I just want to expand my own. Like, I want to get Canadian content out there because I feel like there's a lot of it, and it's a lot better than most people would give it credit for, generally speaking. But also, I just want, you know, we only have so much time to watch movies every week, and
Mm,
I like consuming stuff that is, you know, local,
yeah.
homegrown, as it were. I feel like, again, like it's at least partly. I feel like it's a bit of a responsibility of shows like ours
Yeah. Where do you
to
draw the line
highlight
with
that.
where do you draw the line with Canadian content? Like, is a David Cronenberg directed American funded movie? Is that a Canadian content?
I don't have strong opinions about this. I want to sell. I personally, I would like to celebrate anything that Canadians are doing. So, like, Women Talking is a fantastic film that's starring a bunch of Canadians and directed and adapted by a Canadian who won an Oscar fantastically. But it's American
Mm,
funded, so it's not a quote Canadian film according
mm,
to the Canadian Academy. But
right.
that's a pretty Canadian film, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's it's difficult sometimes to tell where to draw the line.
Yeah.
But definitely, it's definitely easier to be like that's a Canadian film when it's a film that is funded by Canada, by some Canadian
Mm-hmm.
entity.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's a reason why a lot of Canadian films are, oftentimes they're co-productions. That film Brooklyn. I don't know if you ever saw Brooklyn with Saoirse Ronan. Um,
No.
very very lovely film, and it she was nominated for an Oscar for it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not a film you would necessarily think of as being Canadian because it's set in, spoiler alert, Brooklyn, and she's an Irish immigrant to Brooklyn in the 50s, and but it's a Canadian Irish co-production, and it's an adaptation of a novel, and it's just it's very, so there's lots of films that are Canadian that don't necessarily appear Canadian is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Or there was one a couple years ago that I never got around to seeing called French Exit, which I think had Michelle Pfeiffer in it, that won a couple of CSAs, and it was not set in Canada, didn't, as far as I know. So like
Mm-hmm.
it's uh it's sort of a difficult thing. Like it's interesting because we sort of let that go when it's a big Hollywood production that's set in some other country. We're like, well, it's still Hollywood, but um, for Canadian film, in my mind, I always want to be like, well, why isn't it set in Toronto? Like, why isn't it in Montreal? Why isn't it in Canada? And I don't know why. I don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because we don't have the monetary oomph behind our productions yet. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, yeah.
Well, hopefully, exposure is always a good thing, isn't it? And then more exposure means more money, which means more movies. Creativity can only take you far, unfortunately.
Well, the bigger problem with Canadian cinema, and again, I'm just going to point out, I have exactly no inside baseball on any of this because I'm not in film production. But as I understand it, just from listening to some people who I know speak and other people reading articles about it, the bigger problem with Canadian cinema is that we do so much production in Canada for American production companies. Like all current Star Trek is shot in Canada. At least like Strange New Worlds and Discovery are both shot in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Lower Decks is made in Canada. Lots of films are shot in Canada, and that actually ends up taking up like the bulk of our resources and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Like these
Yeah.
foreign productions, there's not necessarily that much left over for actually Canadian productions. And I feel like we could be doing a better job as a nation in promoting that. In much the same way that like the British Lottery funds the creation of arts in Great Britain, I feel like we could be doing more like that here, personally.
I think you've got a difficult job in this country though, because unlike my tiny country, this is a massive country mishmashed together with such different communities and cultures and approaches to life and art and filmmaking. I think it's always hard to say this is a Canadian thing, because then how do you? There's no such thing as one style that shows it as purely Canadian, because there's not one umbrella that could cover from where we are north all the way east. And I think that's why I'm most excited about the. I mean, Brother was exceptionally made, but the indigenous stuff feels like it's a distinct thing that could be called this is a Canadian thing, and I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to have one thing. I think as a nation we contain multitudes, and I think that our art can reflect that. I'm just saying that I think that we could do a much better job of funding said art.
Mm-hmm.
Of making sure, like we already do, we have laws that make sure that Canadian broadcasters have a minimum level of Canadian content. I'm just saying that like I'm sure there's a way we could better fund Canadian content, and not just fund the creation of it, but fund the promotion of it as well. Because Telefilm
Yeah.
Canada funds an actual shit ton of content, um,
Mm.
like lots of TV, lots of movies, but then a lot of it you just never hear about, right? Like
Mm.
the National Film Board funds just a ton of short film and documentary and such like that, and you just never hear about it in a meaningful way, right? Like it's not out there in the public consciousness. And we do have some uh, efforts to do that. Like Made New is pretty good. Um, and there's a couple of big campaigns to forward Canadian content, but I just feel like we could be doing
Yeah.
more. I feel like
Yeah.
Made New is a really good Twitter account, and it's really nice to see Canadian actors talking about Canadian film production in front of movies. But like, why aren't there, I feel like there should be billboards. Like there should be
Yeah.
more of it. Because we do a good job. I think we do a good job, generally speaking.
It's funny you say about short films, actually. One thing that I've really been blown away by is that sometimes CBC seems to have a short film program, because
They do, yeah.
randomly on a Friday or Saturday night at midnight, they'll show like a 25-minute short film. And without exception, they've all been amazing. And there's one sci-fi, I wonder if heard of it. There's a sci-fi short film where a handyman comes to fix something in a woman's house. But and
That's not
there's
a
a
sci-fi film.
wait a minute. But then an alarm goes off and a gas is released, and if you don't hurry and put your gas mask on, you die. And it seems to be a normal part of this sci-fi life. And then one of the masks breaks, and the second alarm comes off, and the women and the men have to fight for this remaining gas mask while they've been friendly up to that point. uh, it's really amazing. And so I think there's a real hotbed of really good short films coming out of this country as well that I would love to see more of.
It's interesting. I was about to say because I think it's been later in previous years, but there's actually a short film festival in Canada called the Future of Film Showcase. I've covered it a couple of times, but I just went to look it up to like so we could maybe promote it as like a thing you could watch, and it actually just ended.
Oh,
And it's another thing that like I'm sure that you can find the films online if you go to it's fofs.ca.
mhm.
Um, but every year it's just short films by up and coming Canadian filmmakers, and they all the ones I've seen have been great. Uh, and
Mhm.
now I look forward to finding this year's too because they like the last times I've watched it have all been really good, and it's short film is another just area of film I think we don't give enough regard to, very generally speaking.
Mhm.
It's it definitely has a function in on the festival circuit and getting new filmmakers recognized. But there's tons of great short films, and we don't,
Mm,
as a
yeah,
society, we do not pay attention to them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So that's the state of Canadian filmmaking. We should probably talk about the movies we've seen now.
I
It's a very interesting
mean,
conversation, though.
probably we should probably talk about. It's not really required. That's not what the people are here for. They're here to hear about our opinion on Canadian short cinema. Let's, right, right. Anyway,
Absolutely.
so that being said, let's dive into our first film, which is the tiny production, super indie, Guardians
Mm,
of the Galaxy Volume 3.
low
Uh,
budget, but makes the most of it.
yeah, so Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, we both finally caught up with, and it's been out in theaters for, I guess, 3 weeks now.
Hmm.
I think this is its third weekend, so 2 weeks in cinemas. Um, It is the third part in the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy from Marvel Studios. All your favorite characters return from those two movies and also from Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. And it finds the Guardians, actually, pretty much right after the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special, which we did, I believe, cover on a Christmas episode of the show.
Hmm.
Um, and it finds them at their home base of nowhere, and they are sort of randomly attacked by a new villain called Adam, who is a creation of the Sovereign, who appeared in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And this leads them. Rocket Raccoon is injured, and they can't help him because he's got, like, his cybernetics have a kill switch that if they try and intervene, it'll just kill him. So they have to go and find the key to turn off the kill switch. And this starts a whole adventure to find this thing, and they end up confronting Rocket Raccoon's past and his creator, the High Evolutionary, who's played wonderfully by Chukwudi Iwuji, and uh, and he is just a terrible, terrible megalomaniac who wants Rocket back because Rocket is the the one creation he's ever made that can show true invention, not just. It's kind of an interesting discussion of, like, of there's definitely a conversation to be had about the current state of AI and this movie, in that all the stuff that the High Evolutionary has ever made is not capable of true invention. But anyway, um, so yeah, the gang goes on this long hijinks filled adventure to save their friend and then to confront the bad guy in the end. And I actually want to spoil as little of this movie as possible because Um, I don't know if you are familiar with the works of James Gunn, but his Guardians trilogy is among the best things that Marvel has made. I think is a pretty well accepted fact. And even his he's now the head of DC Studios, and his Suicide Squad movie is easily one of the best things that came out of the DCEU pre Flash reboot, anyway. And so is the Peacemaker series that he made. And what he is really, really, really good at, aside from just managing an ensemble, but he's also really, really, really good at managing the emotional core of his stories. And this movie is no exception. This movie dives very deep into the very tragic backstory of Rocket Raccoon, who is very clearly an insert for the author himself. And there's definitely moments in this movie that will bring a tear to your eye. I cried in the theater. I'll just say it. I cried in the theater at certain moments in this movie, and James Gunn is really good at making. It's sort of the same thing that Taika Waititi's really good at, in that he's really good at the sort of, like, happy sad or sad happy, if that makes sense. Um, in that, like, everything will sort of work out, but not necessarily the way you think, and uh, it'll make you cry along the way. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling because I don't want to. I want to talk about how much I like this movie, but I don't want to talk too much about the story of this movie because I think it's important to see it for
Mhm.
the first time with fresh eyes. But what did you very generally think about the movie?
So there's a lot to like about this film, and I don't think you're wrong saying it's the trilogy is probably the best thing that's come out of the MCU as a whole thing. Um, and I James Gunn is a really distinct and interesting filmmaker and scriptwriter, and even when something doesn't wholly land, I still think he's got such a dynamic way of presenting a story that it like the look of this film and its editing and its just general visual quality is just quite a bit higher than Quantum Mania or Thor: Love and Thunder. Like it's got a depth to it, and it's got a real spark to it. And there's some design choices in this that I loved so much. I wish they'd been the main part of the story. At one point, they go to a place, and the place is filled with things, and those things become a central part of that part of the MacGuffin recovery. And I kind of wish that had been the whole movie, to be honest, because the pace really picks up at that point, and the design, the character design, which I think appears to be a mix of physical makeup and CG, but I think it's a sign that because I can't wholly tell, I think it's a really good sign actually that I'm not sure what is. There's definitely a lot of physical makeup and prosthetics, and they're really successful. And
So
there's
are you
some.
talking about the place they go in the second act or the place they go in the third act?
I'm talking about the place they go in the. Hang on, the second act. The
The
second act.
the space
The
station like place.
no, the oh, isn't that the third act? That's the third act, surely.
So there's
The
a
the
again
place
that
with the ball. It's in the trailer. You know the part where
oh
where
yeah yeah
Drax
yeah
throws the ball at
the
someone.
planet you're talking about the planet. Okay, good.
The planet. Yeah, I'm trying not to add any specificity at all. They go to a planet, and it's filled with a life type, and I just love really good visual design, character design, and I just thought it worked brilliantly. And it kind of James Gunn's talked a lot about how he wanted these to be his Star Wars, and that whole planet sequence really felt like he was going for that kind of feel, but it was very very distinct, and the physical makeup's excellent, and the design and I guess the CG integration is excellent as well. And their arrival to their leaving, that whole sequence, I think is really really good. I overall, if I have an issue with this movie, I wasn't. Uh, I was surprised at how overtly violent it was in many places. In that, not just comic book violence, which is sometimes shown, sometimes alluded to, as it is in Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, but visual graphic violence, like bones being broken and blood and shots and significant, like if you are a person who has issues with animal cruelty, you should know that this might not be the movie for you to watch. Like it is. I think the first one that has a PG-13 rating. I would have to check that against the other two Guardians of the Galaxy. It's certainly
I think they're all PG-13 actually. I
well.
think
It's certainly.
basically every Marvel movie is PG-13. That's sort of like the
Oh, okay.
demographic they're shooting for.
It certainly felt this. This certainly feels for an older audience than Guardians 1 and 2. There's certainly enough overt violence in this that would make me reconsider showing it to my kids at this point. And certainly my daughter wouldn't be able to cope with the adult stuff. It's very gut wrenching because Rocket in his injury is in the first half of the movie he's only really present as in the young flashbacks. Maybe it's more than half actually, and those flashbacks are devastating, really devastating, and
Hmm.
it's a much darker movie on the whole. What I did the angle of it being darker, I thought actually made it a really good coda to end the whole end game like a really nice epilogue to Endgame. I thought, in the ways the other movies since Endgame haven't really been like they haven't really addressed the trauma that people felt from that experience in a way that I thought this film did quite successfully. And the way I've seen many people in their review of this talk about it as this is probably going to be their end of their Marvel sort of chapter of their lives, because they felt like it took the themes that resonated from Endgame and kind of drew them all to a close. And what's nice about this film is that every single character in this movie achieves an end to their arc, very clearly, very specifically, almost in a rote fashion. They get a end of the arc, which is this is who you really are, and that's that been an ongoing theme in Guardians of the Galaxy, is like learning who you not who you project yourself to be, but who you really are inside. And there's definitely one moment you probably can guess the moment. The only bit of this movie where I got teary eyed was an end to an arc really close to the end of the movie, and I have to say as well, I thought Zoe Saldana was absolutely exceptional. And the thing about Gamora, it's not really a spoiler because it's been introduced before, but the Gamora from Endgame has gone, and this is an alternate Gamora. And I think what Saldana's done with the performance style and the physical style, and also the hair and makeup's different as well, but her mirror approach to Gamora, I think, is just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And
Yeah,
she same character, different reflection. I thought she was absolutely exceptional in this.
I think like her performance, and but also the way that Gamora is written in this movie, I think is also really exceptional and interesting. I think so. I think Gamora. One thing I did want to talk about, and it's mildly spoilery, so I'm sorry. Um, but one thing that's really interesting in this movie to me is that Gamora is in it, right? So Gamora dies in Infinity War, and she's a version of her is brought forward from the past in Endgame, who now exists. So it is Gamora, but it's not our Gamora from previously, and it would have been super easy to just give her a revelatory moment and turn her back into the Gamora we love. And this film very explicitly chooses not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of the smartest and most interesting choices that maybe a Marvel film has made in
Mm-hmm.
years. Um, because like there are, Marvel films are fine, but they often take the safer route, right? And this this
Yeah.
whole theme of like Peter having to accept that she's not his Gamora, and it takes
Mm.
the whole film for it to happen because that's how films work. But anyway, um,
Yeah.
um, and when he finally does accept that, like when he accepts that she's not his Gamora, and she finally admits that, like there's a moment between them at the very end that is just a wonderfully acted moment
Mm.
from both of
Yeah,
them,
it's
and it's a
good. It's really good.
wonderfully written moment as they part ways. And I don't want to spoil it, but like again, like this whole arc is just wonderful, and I'm really glad they didn't just be like, oh, I remembered, give her the same experience again and turn her
Yeah,
into the
I
same
thought they were
character.
totally thought they were going to do that when she started listening to the music in the ship. I thought that was going to
Yeah,
be the trigger.
yeah, that or like the moment where they do finally save Rocket, and there's a moment where
Mm.
she
Mm.
she smiles at them and they're found family, and there's a moment then when you're like, oh, okay, she's coming around, right? But the film
Yeah.
never goes there. It clearly like reignites the spark to make this Gamora more
Mm.
sympathetic and to make her maybe closer to
Yeah.
our old
Yeah,
Gamora, but
definitely. Oh, for
but
sure.
never turns her into our old Gamora, and really actually closes the door on her and Quill being together. And I think
Yeah,
that's really really
completely.
smart.
And they could have thought eye patched that so easily. Just like, oh no, he's fine now. Oh no, she's Gamora again. She heard the music. She can now understand Groot. She's back. But it was a far stronger ending and a far braver ending too. And it is. It's a minor spoiler, but it's written so well up to that point. Definitely, that's one of the best parts of the film, I think.
Yeah. And then there's a really interesting, it's not really happening, but there's a really interesting hint of like maybe Nebula has a crush on Peter, and I find that really interesting.
it's, yeah, it's
Like
a little
it's
more than into that. Yeah. And the humanization of Nebula, and that is definitely part of it. And when there's another part later on where she's definitely softening, and that's part of it as well. And her kind of almost being angry at these feelings she's having as well. It's
oh no
Karen
no
Gillan's fantastic in this.
not almost. She's definitely angry at the feeling that she's having. She doesn't. That's all another whole thing with the Guardians, right? Nebula is angry because she doesn't know how to process these other feelings she's having that
Mm,
aren't anger, right? The humanization of a Nebula over the Guardians trilogy and Endgame in particular, I think is one of the most successful arcs that the MCU has done.
mm,
And but at the end of the day, this movie is ultimately Rocket's movie, right? Like Rocket
yeah,
is he's not even really in it for the first
yeah.
act and a half because he's incapacitated, but he is ultimately I think he's actually the protagonist of the Guardians trilogy, right?
Mhm,
Like functionally, yes, it's definitely Peter in 1 and 2. That's Peter dealing with
mm,
his past and his daddy issues and so on, but like I know from interviews that Rocket is the character James Gunn identifies with. And
mm,
it his arc from being, you know, at the very beginning he's very acerbic, pushes people away, doesn't think anyone will ever love him, to the second film where it literally ends with him crying at a fireworks display realizing that when he dies people will miss him, to at the end of this movie basically being the one who's like, wait, we're like, what? Like, I can't. It's so hard to talk about without spoilers. But the
I did enjoy the analogy of the grand, what's it called? The grand evolutionary,
the High Evolutionary,
the
yeah,
high evolutionary, who is absolutely not an allegory for Disney. Chooses to get rid of his chosen son, and then realizes he's the only one with a brain, and does everything they can do to get him back. Like that's pretty thin.
I mean, yeah, I was going to come back to that too. Like, so his arc over the three movies is as with Nebula's. I think so. Everyone in this movie, every one of the Guardians, does get a fairly complete arc, but I think Nebula's and Rockets are actually the most complete and probably the most touching. And but yeah, in this film in particular, the High Evolutionary is an insert for Disney, and Rocket is an insert for James Gunn and his whole saga of being fired. Is it's on the nose, we'll say. It's it's not well obfuscated, um, but it is really well executed. And that's the thing about these movies is that, and I feel like that was maybe the thing that was missing from the Suicide Squad was that these films feel very personal for James Gunn to me, and
Mm,
this film may be the most personal of the three, and
mhm.
as a result, I found it. I know you prefer the first one, and I prefer the second one, and I know I'm definitely in the minority on that, but I feel like the ones where he touches on something, the more personal it touches on, the more I resonate with it, and this one feels very
Mm,
much in that camp for me.
mhm. I
It
do
is hard
think.
to talk about without spoiling exactly why, but this movie is very touching. In addition to being, again, like you were saying, overtly violent and overtly kind of gross and disgusting at times, and
Mm,
uh, there are definitely going to be some moments where people are like, I was definitely squirming in my seat at some of the animal
mm,
stuff. Um,
yeah.
I don't think like I've definitely seen at least one person online being like, this movie glorifies animal cruelty, and my response to that is like, you clearly didn't
Glorifies.
watch the movie. Like, showing a thing is not endorsing a thing, and that seems to be a way people think about things now,
What?
that if you show a thing you're endorsing it. That's just not true. um,
Just,
but that being said, like, it's pretty rough. Like, it's very, and even the worst
it
of it is
doesn't.
only really implied, but the way it's implied based on what you've already seen is just heart
So
rending.
I my my only frame of reference is my children, and so if you've got children who loved Guardians 1 and 2, just be careful with Guardians 3, because my kids could not cope with Guardians 3, and they've seen a lot. But my daughter in particular, she's explicitly said, "I'll watch anything. I just don't want to watch any animals getting hurt." That's her line, and so clearly this is not this is very much not the movie for her. But even for my son, like, there's the overt violence. So it kind of surprised me, and the my takeaway from this movie, the things that I wish were different, is that there is choices in this movie to make things more violent than they necessarily needed to be. There's certain shots that happen that didn't have to be that shot, and I think it would have been. I think it would have been better if those shots hadn't been in there. If the but and I also think it's a touch too long. I think it tries to do too much, and the pace suffers. But the reason I love Guardians 1 is that I really enjoy spending time with these idiots, being idiots together. And I've always loved we're going to get through this, we're going to improvise our way through this and get through it by working as a team, by being idiots. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're the best at it. It just means that we don't, like, tenacity is my favorite quality
Yeah, we
in
just don't stop.
yeah, it's same with Indiana Jones. Like, he's not always successful; he just doesn't stop. Like, what truck? What truck is probably one of my all-time favorite line reads in any movie. And there's a lot of that in Guardians of the Galaxy 1. And to be fair, it happens in 3 as well. But I think because Rocket's removed from the ensemble for so long, I've found the pace. It doesn't really get to that goofiness, the idiots being idiots together, improvising their way through bad situations till they get to the planet. And I absolutely adored that whole middle section when they're just improvising their way through this solution. I thought it was really, really strong. And I think the final act, the final set piece, was perhaps a little bloated as well, but it does have a single, quote unquote, single shot, because I'm sure it's of course it's many, many shots, but very hard to see that how it's stitched together. There's a single battle shot as a one shot in a corridor that is very likely the best single fight in any Marvel movie, and I include Avengers in that as well. Like, it is it's all about choreography. A good fight scene is exactly the same as a dance scene. It's
Uh,
exactly the same thing. It's all about the choreography. It is. It is. It's the choreography and the editing, and
no, so I'm gonna
allowing us
interrupt to be like it is at least half the choreography, but as we've discussed many times before, it is also the way you shoot the damn thing.
Yep, so that's exactly where I was going with. So it's being able to see and be present in the geography of the choreography as well. It's being able to follow how the choreography links together. So you're absolutely right. It's the being able to be present in that moment and not be cut away from it. And that's very hard to do in a one shot, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of planning, which is why we watch a bunch of terrible movies that are cut to like 20 cuts for one action scene. And the way it kind of swept. I always love as well characters popping into frame over the top of characters so they can be given their hero moment. Avengers does this very well as well, but I thought this was better, and I'm going to be rewatching that scene over and over and over, because it's just
Yeah,
from a filmmaking perspective, it's really good, really, really good.
yeah, and I think it helps that, as I understand it, most or all of the film was shot with IMAX cameras, like with IMAX intended as its like main way to be
Oh,
viewed,
really?
and
Oh,
that just means that like you can't move those cameras around as much, and so
mm,
having the so as a result, the all of the scenes with action, there's a bunch of long takes. Actually, one of the opening shots of the film is a long single take that's clearly just a long single take that I thought was wonderful,
mm,
even though it's kind of somber. And
yeah,
the just the the color of this film is
mm,
so distinct and wonderful and lovely compared to like that was one of the complaints about Quantumania is that it looks kind of sludgy, right? Like a lot of Marvel movies look they were color graded to match concrete, and this is one of the movies where it doesn't feel that way. Everything's very bright, very comfortable, very very
Primary colors as well. When they get
primary
to the
colors, lots of
lab,
contrasts,
yeah,
um, and you can just see it all. Like you can see detail in the background that you just haven't been able to see
yeah.
in ages. And from a filmmaking perspective, it's one of the best made things so far that they've done, I would say.
Oh, easily.
Um,
So,
and
so
like
what's your
we haven't even begun to talk about like Adam Warlock is a new character in this movie, and
yeah?
I really enjoy the choice to make him developmentally a child. um, because like he's such a serious, somber, boring one note. Like I'm sorry, he's a major part of the Marvel cosmic continuity, and he's a major part of the whole Infinity Saga in the comics, and he's also kind of boring. And I really just love the choice to invert that in this and to make him kind of a goof, kind of an idiot, kind of a child. And I think that Will Poulter does a really great job of like conveying that. But for me, I would say honestly the standouts in this film would be Zoe Saldana, like you said, Karen Gillan, like you said. I think that Bradley Cooper actually this might be his best turn as Rocket and one of
Yeah.
his
Oh,
better
sure.
performances.
Yeah, sure.
Um, it's great to have Linda Cardinelli back. It's great to have Nathan Fillion back in a way that is not just a one scene cameo behind a ton of CG or a poster on the wall. And Chris Pratt is doing his thing, and I think he's quite good this time. But for me, the standout is Chukwudi Iwuji, who plays the High Evolutionary. And I'm just going to say, if Marvel learns anything from this movie, it should be hire more people from the Royal Shakespeare Company to be a Shakespearean level bad guy in your movies,
Mm,
because he's. It's been a long time since we had a villain who was just a straight up villain without
mm,
some like weird sympathetic background that we were meant to relate to. He's just a bad guy. He's just an asshole. He's just a villain, and he chews the absolute shit out of the exquisite scenery.
yeah.
And I enjoyed every second of him. I enjoyed every second of hating him on screen.
He was exceptional. I mean, he's a great actor, and I think I really enjoyed his uh, very clearly directed physicality. He had this thing where if he wanted to walk up to speak to someone, he kind of put his left the foot that's furthest away from the camera really far ahead of his hip and sort of squatted down into it, and so his whole body is like pressed forward and his arms are out as well, and it's a theater technique, but it looks really really good, especially as he's clearly not all there, very unhinged, and he would. It's a shame. I don't know what's happening with Jonathan Majors, but he would make if they needed to swap another black actor in for Kang very quickly. I'm sure they
Oh,
could. I'm sure they could work that in very very well, and he'd be exceptional.
so it's never the High Evolutionary is never named as a variant of Kang in this movie, but also he wears a purple suit and he's played by an African American, sorry, African British um, actor. And I think that it would be very easy to just recast Kang with this guy, and it would be easy to be like, oh, we're all variants of. It's fine. Just recast him. I think it
Yeah,
would be wonderful.
yeah,
And regardless of what's going on with Jonathan Majors, like let's say best case scenario, he is cleared of all charges and reforms himself to be not an asshole on set. He's just too toxic right now, right? So just
yeah,
recast him, buy him out of his contract. You can definitely fucking afford it, Disney. Buy him out of his contract and cast this guy instead.
yeah. He's very good. It's very very good. So, what's your trilogy ranking? If we remove the holiday special out, your the three movies. What's your one, two, three of one, two, three?
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about this last night, and I don't honestly know because it's so it's such a good, complete story. The three of them together, it's actually I think pretty hard for me to rank them individually. Um, but I prefer two to one. So it's more of a question of, do I prefer this one or one?
Mm-hmm.
And it's I find it very hard to choose between the first chapter and the last chapter of a story as being better, because the
Mm-hmm.
first chapter has all the fun introductory stuff and the last chapter has all the resolution stuff, and I don't know how to pick between those two things. So
Mm-hmm.
having only just seen it yesterday, I don't think I have an answer for that question just yet,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is my cop out answer. Yeah.
For me, I think it's much easier for me because I don't like Volume Two. I adore the first one, and I thought this one was fine. So it's 1-3-2 for me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's probably for me like two and then one and three in a tie, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's fine.
and that's not to say that one and three are bad; they're both great. But two, just like two, deals with stuff that always affects me in a way that
Yeah,
it's a very personal take. But I also
yeah,
think I also think two looks better than one, but that's a whole other discussion.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, so how many stars are you gonna give it today?
A 3-star movie for me. It's good. It's fine. There's elements that um that didn't work for me. That I've already outlined. It's 3 stars. How about for you?
It's four for me. It's definitely four.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess that, yeah, basically puts it on par with one for me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a, like I say, as a whole, I think the Guardians story is probably it's it's on par with the strongest stories told in the MCU. But overall, it's clearly the most competently made from start to finish.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's even on par. I'm struggling to think of another uh themed entry that is as good as those three together. I want to say, like, I know I don't like two very much, but I think they are quintessentially what I think about when you transfer a comic story to a movie. Like, it's bright, flashy, funny, ridiculous, serious notes. Um, in a way that I think the other, like the Iron Mans or the Avengers, I think lost their way with all of those elements.
I think that
So I
I think
think,
that Captain America's story is top tier in the Marvel universe. That's held back by middling filmmaking,
mm, yeah,
personally.
at least the filmmaking's good. Even if you don't like elements of these movies, the filmmaking's always good. I think James Gunn's a very interesting filmmaker, as I said earlier.
Yeah, he really is. And speaking to the whole violence aspect, you can definitely tell that he got his start working at Trauma in this one.
Mm,
Like he
hmm.
does,
Oh
his
yeah,
roots
yeah,
his roots are still in horror, and I think that that's an interesting
yeah,
thing.
yeah, for sure. Good.
Yeah,
So go see it. Go see
yeah,
this movie. See what you think.
yeah. Or
So
it'll be on streaming. It'll be on Disney Plus eventually. So,
yeah, yeah.
but having made having had the chance to see it in a theater, I would say that if you can see it on a giant screen, you will be rewarded for doing so.
Yeah.
It is a gorgeous film to look at.
It is. It's so colourful as well. In a world where colour has been removed from all major movies, it honestly drives me crazy. My kids, my mum, my wife wants to take the kids to see Little Mermaid remake, and
Hmm.
I'm pushing back because Little Mermaid's in the four Disney movies that I think are 5-star exceptional. The movies that completely connect me to Disney. Little Mermaid's one of them. And secondly, it's just so fucking dark. Like everything I've seen from it, it's just so fucking bland and dark, and I just don't want to see that.
So
But yeah,
I can tell you the early reviews for that film are out, and they basically universally say it's not as it's not as dark and bland as it is in the trailers,
oh good.
and but also much like Aladdin, um, when it's trying to be its own new thing, it's great, and when it's trying to be the thing it was, like when it's trying to be the animated series, the animated show,
Hmm.
it's fine at best.
Yeah,
So
there's no surprises on.
no.
Oh well. Okay, so we should move on to our second movie as we're almost hitting an hour.
Yeah, we should. So why don't you give us a lowdown on the new Elevation Pictures here in Canada and A24 release in America? You Hurt My Feelings, starring Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Tobias Menzies, and written and directed by Nicole Holofcener.
Who I'd not heard of before, but I will definitely be checking out her work because this is a brilliantly written uh, stab at people our age who are involved in anything creative. It's basically a very sparkly written romantic comedy, romantic dramedy about the lies we tell each other in relationships in order to make the other person feel good. And Julia Louis Dreyfus plays Beth, who's a writer. Her first book, which was a memoir of her growing up, did fairly well, but her second book, which is a work of fiction, it's a crime fiction that even her agent hasn't read yet, and turns out it's probably not very good. So she's struggling with her own creativity. Her husband, played by Tobias Menzies, is a psychoanalyst, psychologist, maybe, uh, and he is doubting whether he's even any good at it because he just feels tired. And then the Beth's sister, who seems to buy lights for entitled rich people her whole life, is married to a wannabe actor. And so basically, it's one of those things where everyone's trying to do their best and lying. Everyone's lying to everyone, but not out of uh, maliciousness. It's out of trying to make the other person feel that their creative exploit is valued. And it's a light film. It's an hour and a half. It's very snappy. It has a very clear beginning, middle, and end, and it has a nice conclusion. It's not too deep, but the script is sparkling. The acting is really really good, and it does make you kind of question. Like, I'm 46 and I've been with the same woman for 21 years and married since 2007. And you're in a very similar position, and you're going to recognize a lot of your relationships here because you do fall into ruts, you do fall into patterns, you do fall into not telling your partner the whole truth and not being your honest self. And I think that builds like plaque, doesn't it? And sometimes you just got to clean your teeth. And this movie is like something's overheard and truths come out. And what I really, really, really liked about this film is that what I thought was going to happen is that these older people realize that the spark has gone from their relationship and they don't want to be together. But without really spoiling anything, this film's much more about. It doesn't even go down that route of maybe our relationship is not the spark it used to be. It's more about why don't we tell each other the truth? Why are we not honest with each other anymore? Why do you tell me my book is good when you don't think that? And it's more like, well, I don't care if the book is good. I just want you to feel that it's good. And so much of this movie, surprisingly, is about the way we show love for others is just lying to them,
Pretty
and
much. Yep.
to make them feel good. And it's the first half of this movie. I'm like, oh god, this is going to give me questions because I've been involved in creative stuff my whole life, and that need for validation is just crippling. Validation from especially from your loved ones. And um, this movie really, really focuses on writing, acting, professional validation, like when we all feel like when we haven't got the spark anymore. And that really resonated with me. And what I really liked about its conclusion was like finding a way to support each other through being honest and through still being supportive, but just being honest with each other. And I thought it was just really sweet. It's a really sweet movie, and I enjoyed it way more than I thought I would. I did not want to watch this movie. I watched the trailer and thought I don't want to watch this film. A, because I'm so busy and it doesn't feel like something that's going to engage me, and also I don't want to feel things about my own life at the moment. I want escapism. And so what I appreciated about this film was that the script was beautiful, and I love Julia Louis Dreyfus. Like, I think she's just amazing. And Tobias Menzies really surprised me. I've never seen him in this role before. Um, he's usually more of a stuck-up English man on a boat something like that. He's got a very respectable American accent, and he just underplays it very, very well. And it's just a really nice group ensemble, and everyone kind of finds an answer. And also, they've got a son called Elliot, spelt in the same way as my Elliot, and it felt very true to me, and I really enjoyed it. How about you?
Yeah, that's you basically covered it. I mean, it's not the deepest of films, but it's not. It doesn't really have to be either. Like I know it originally premiered at Sundance, so I know a number of people who've seen it, and that was sort of a complaint that it doesn't really go into any real depth, but it doesn't have to. Like the subject matter
Mm,
is fairly straightforward, and the dialogue and the performances thereof uh, are are pretty great throughout, and
mm,
it's not trying to be anything more than it is. Right? It's a story about we lie to one another, and why do we do it, and should we do it? That's pretty much it. And it's 93 minutes of those questions, and
mm.
it turns out when you get a couple of great actors together, and they talk about these things, you're going to come up with some answers, like, and
Mm-hmm.
Nicole Holofcener is a really good writer, and the dialogue, in particular, the dialogue between um, the husband and wife, between Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Tobias Menzies, um, is just so like spot on for anyone who's been in a long term relationship. The way they speak to one another has a cadence and tone that you will recognize, uh,
Mm.
right down to the fact that they're like they're intimate in small ways that makes their son uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
it's not to say that they're like making out in public, but just the way they share food and the way they like
Oh,
play off one another.
yeah.
um, I think that'll hit home for many people,
Yes,
because it's a true thing, and
it is.
that's really the hallmark of a great screenplay like this, right? Is that it digs down to some
Mm.
core truths, and this film does a really good job of that. And I think that Julia Louis Dreyfus is at, she's been at her peak for 2 decades now, but she's still at her peak, in terms of the way she's able to rattle off this dialogue in hilarious but ultimately meaningful ways.
Mm.
Um, and you're right. Usually, Tobias Menzies plays someone who, I mean, he won an Emmy or a Golden Globe for playing Prince Charles, not Prince Charles, Prince Philip, um,
Yeah.
recently, and that's exactly the kind of character I'm used to seeing in him. Like the first time I
Mm.
saw Tobias Menzies, he was Brutus in HBO's Rome, um,
Oh, right.
in which he's great. But yeah, he's usually he has a he has that he has a British accent that, without trying to sound like an asshole, the only word I can think that describes his particular British accent is smug.
Yep.
Like
Oh, yeah. You
he's
get
not
that a lot.
trying to be smug, but he sounds smug. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Oh, yeah. For
Um,
sure.
and that's usually the kind of character that he plays. And this one is a much more down to earth. I really enjoyed his performance as someone who's just having a real like crisis, like existential crisis about his life. And
Mm.
there's a conversation in this film between, as they, the whole inciting incident being that he says behind her back that he doesn't like her book, and she overhears this. And when they finally have a conversation about it later in the film, that conversation is by far my favorite scene in the movie.
Mm.
Just the way they explain to one another why they are telling the lies they tell, and
Yeah.
him even being like, "You're always telling me I'm a good therapist, but you don't fucking know. Like, you've never been
Mm.
in therapy with me. Like, why do you do that?" And that whole conversation is just wonderful from start to finish, and I think many, many, many people will relate to.
Yeah.
And again, anyone in a long-term relationship, this film is going to have something for you.
Yeah, for sure. I
Um,
really like I really like how the story was told as well. I've Something that really is pissing me off at the moment is unnecessary exposition in the way a narrative is portrayed. I really hate in filmmaking when we're told something instead of the filmmaker using a creative way to show us that thing, or the script using implication the script using implication to tell us the facts instead of a fact. And I thought the script was so good at giving us information without telling us what the information is, just through half conversations, through the characters relationship. Like we learn it through context. What a concept. We watch a movie and we learn the information through context. And this script is exactly what I've been talking about, in that it used filmmaking and clever script writing to get the same information to us instead of telling us directly this is who this person is and this is what's happening, which really pisses me off. It was really good.
Yeah, I also does a really good job of making characters feel whole and real. And I think maybe a good example of that is there's a character in this movie who is talked about but never seen who feels real. Uh, and that's, I mean, that's difficult to pull off, but this movie manages to do it. Like the son has a girlfriend who you never see, who is only ever spoken about, but she still feels like a real person. And I really enjoyed that. And we talked a lot about Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Tobias Menzies, but Owen Teague is a hell of an up and
Yeah,
comer, and
yeah.
he's been in a number of really great things in the last few years, and I really really hope that continues because he's got a
Mm-hmm.
really interesting natural presence,
Mm-hmm.
and he's really good. I mean, most of the stuff that I've seen him in, like, you've probably seen him in like the It movies, and he was in an episode of Black Mirror, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But he was in an HBO show called Mrs. Fletcher, with Catherine Hahn, and he's just excellent in it as this kid who doesn't know. He ends up in this basically in a relationship with an older woman played by
Mm-hmm.
Catherine Hahn, and they both sort of discover who they are through this relationship, and it's just wonderful, and he's really good in it. So I really hope that he continues to have um, make great choices like this. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah,
and
so I think
honestly, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, I think, Michaela Watkins, who plays the sister, who
mm-hmm.
has like a very particular tone of voice and a very particular way of delivering things that complements Julia Louis-Dreyfus's so well. She's one of those actors who she's not super super famous, but when she does show up and stuff, you're like, oh, it's her. She's great,
Yeah,
and
and
this movie was no
Janine,
exception.
Janine Berlin as the mum as well is, I mean, she's brilliantly written. I have to say as well. Her lines with the hints of the dementia that's coming, but it's never actually like talked about.
Yeah,
It's exquisitely written, and the interplay between the two sisters and the mum is so hilarious, but also so fucking real, so true.
yeah.
There's one that who'd have known a conversation about how to transport potato salad would make me go, "Oh my god, I've had this exact like conversation. I've been there myself." So it's one of those movies where you're going to recognize yourself. And you and I and our friend Rob have had the exact conversation about sock quality as well. So
Oh yeah, that's true. That's really true.
we are these people.
Yeah, this is actually basically a really good example of, if anyone ever says why don't they make movies for adults anymore, you can just say, you know what, You Hurt My Feelings comes out on May 26th, 2023 in cinemas, and you can go watch it, because this is very much a film made for adults, and I adore it
Yeah,
just for that.
it's a nice adult like lunch date movie, but also it's going to be on demand very very soon. So don't feel bad if you miss it in the theater. It's nice to support it in the theater if you can, but it's also good. It's a lovely snuggle at home with a bottle of wine movie too. So when you have an opportunity to watch it that fits you, you're I don't think you're going to miss anything by watching it at home instead of on the big screen. But
Hmm.
it's really lovely. I know your opinion is watch everything on the big screen if you can. I don't really disagree with you, but it's a lovely, comforting movie. However you watch it.
I mean, I will say that 100%. Just when you get a chance, you should watch it. However you get a chance, take that chance.
Also, I'm here for the David Cross renaissance. Not that he ever really went away, but I've seen him in two things now, where he's a grumpy man with a white beard, and I think he is. He's got a brilliant, snappy delivery that you don't really see in Arrested Development. and I really really like him in
Oh,
this.
I disagree. You definitely see his delivery. The difference
Yeah,
here is that he's being acerbic and not ridiculous. But you could definitely see that delivery in everything that he does. Um,
okay
and
then.
and in particular, like if you don't believe me, just go look up old episodes of Mr. Show with Bob and David, which is his
Oh, I
comedy.
have no idea what that is.
He had a sketch comedy show with Bob Odenkirk called Mr. Show with Bob and David, and it's really funny.
Bob Odenkirk did a comedy show.
Bob Odenkirk is a comedian.
What?
Yeah, he just transitioned to drama like not that like in the span of his career, he became very famous for drama very recently.
Huh, I had no idea. I
Yeah,
hadn't heard of him before Breaking Bad.
yeah.
Oh well, that's good. I will check that out.
I don't know. Maybe are you not maybe not cut up because David Cross also had an episode of What We Do in the Shadows. I think last year. I think
Who's
pretty sure.
who was he and what we do in the shadows?
No, I think I'm just looking at that. He was season 3. He was Dominicus the Dreadful in season 3.
Was that him?
Yeah.
My
Uh, yeah. It's it's yeah. It's a good show. You should definitely watch that show. Anyway, how many stars are
uh,
you going to give to You Hurt Mine Feelings?
I went back and forth between 3 and 4, but I think this for other 3-star movies, I think this is uh, like objectively, it's a 4-star movie. It's so well written, well directed, well made, well edited, and it's so sweet. The fact that it's very light, I think, shouldn't be held against it because I actually like that element. So it's a 4-star movie for me. How about you?
It's 4 for me as well. Just because again, it is light, but it's also very true and honest, and
Yeah,
I value that in my cinema.
yeah, 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 definitely.
So yeah, so we are over overtime. So thank you for sticking with us through this whole episode. To answer your question, Simon, no, I have no idea what we're covering next week. But we do have. I I am accredited for the Tribeca Film Festival, so we may have at least one episode where I get us some Tribeca Film Festival things to cover. That starts in 2 or 3 weeks. It's through the middle of June, anyway. Um, so look for that. You'll also be able to see my TV coverage of Tribeca on that shelf in the coming weeks as well. Um, yeah. So that is the end of the show. So we're going to end it here. Thank you for listening to everyone who is listening, whether you're new here or old here. We appreciate you very much. You can find the show on the socials at Awesome Friday CA on Twitter and Instagram. You can find Simon on Twitter at Temporary Pen. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at SmatthewAF. If you've liked what you heard, please consider giving us a like, a subscribe, a 5-star rating, whatever your podcasting platform of choice lets you do. Please do those things. Those things are what get us onto the charts and in front of more eyeballs and earballs. So we would very much appreciate it. And if you'd like to support us more directly, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/MC Simpson, which will be in the show notes. And every tier of support does get bonus features, bonus conversation every week. This week we talked about Star Trek Lower Decks and Letterkenny, which it sounds
Oh,
like
nice.
it sounds like a discordant pair, but I promise you it works. Um, we record this here in Vancouver on the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. One last time, thank you so much for listening and for joining us on this Awesome Friday.
Bye.